I'm going to hand straight over to this afternoon's chair, Jacqueline Butler.
Hello. I think before we begin, I would really like to add my thanks to the comments that Jane made. I thought the talks this morning were absolutely fantastic. And I think it's really interesting that we continue with this idea of memory and identity. We have 3 papers with 4 practitioners talking about photography, landscape, and there's an element of filmmaking in all 3 papers. I'm very excited as a practitioner to be chairing this event. I think there are not enough practitioners talking about the process of making, and they tend to reflect back on everything that sort of seems to be seamless. It's very difficult to be a practitioner. So I'm absolutely delighted that all 3 papers are going to expose themselves to an extent and reveal something of the process of what it's like to be a photographer, filmmaker, dealing with landscape. So I'll hand over to Janan Al-Ani, who is currently Senior Research Fellow at LCC. She's said she's quite happy to explain everything herself. I think she's going to begin with a film.
Yeah. I'm going to show a film for about 8 minutes, and then afterwards I'm going to talk a little bit about the body of work that this film comes from and to describe the research and development of the project. So if we could just have the lights really down as far as possible. Is that the darkest it can be? Sorry. This is actually a film that's an HD film, so it won't run as smoothly or look as fine as it should do when it's shown properly.
the 100 meters back. That's the departure well.
So the title of that film is Shadow Sites 2, and it's part of a body of work called, it has a long title, complicated title, The Aesthetics of Disappearance, A Land Without People. And I'm glad, Jacqueline, that you started by talking about the kind of messiness and the complexity of the beginnings of making work, but I am going to kind of present this in a more seamless way. So I'm going to start by saying one of the starting points for this work was a story that appeared in 2004 in The Independent, in the wake of the 2003 Iraq War. And the article was about a forensic anthropologist, an Englishwoman called Margaret Cox, who had been working in Iraq to try and identify the victims of Saddam's regime, of the Ba'athist regime in Iraq. And she'd been uncovering lots of enormous mass graves had been uncovered, and she was part of the team that was working to try and identify the victims from the mass graves. And this article actually opened with her describing work that she'd done in the late 90s in Kosovo, where she'd been trying to identify the victims of the Serbian genocide. And she described working with her team of fellow forensic anthropologists, and how they would head out into the countryside, and they would start by looking for a blue butterfly, a particular species of blue butterfly. And the reason they did this was that this butterfly only fed on a species of wildflower that tended to grow where the soil had recently been disturbed. So they would go out, they would follow the butterflies, they would find the flowers growing en masse, and invariably they'd dig and they would discover mass graves. So I was very struck. Can we not have it so bright? Maybe just turn all the lights on a little bit. So I was really struck by this image of, and the Kosovo landscape being very verdant and green and beautiful. You know, the idea of the trace of something terrible, like a mass killing or a genocide, somehow leaving a trace on the surface of the earth, but one that was telling a different story, perhaps. So it also made me think more generally about the disappearance of the body in the landscape, but also about the way in which, during war and conflict, the way in which the civilian population suffers, and how common it is for civilians to disappear, to be disappeared. So I was thinking about what just happened in Iraq, and I was also thinking back generally to the history of the Middle East, the 20th century history of the Middle East, thinking from the beginning, starting with the Armenian genocide in 1915 and moving through to the formation of the State of Israel, the eradication of Israeli Palestinian villages. Something like 400 Palestinian villages were destroyed after the formation of the State of Israel, thinking about the civil war in Lebanon, where thousands of civilians have disappeared and still haven't been accounted for. So I was thinking generally about those issues, and also thinking about how the representation of landscape itself in conflict had changed so radically since the 91 Gulf War. So one of the things that was extraordinary about the 91 Gulf War was the way in which images of the conflict were so tightly controlled. This was the first major conflict that American forces had been involved in since Vietnam. It was the kind of consolidation of the embedding of journalists with the advancing armies, and the way in which we saw for the first time, really. I mean, it'd been seen before with the attacks on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but somehow the way in which the currency in terms of images of that war was images that were shot from the air. So we were placed as viewers in the position of the fighter pilots who were dropping the ordnance, who were controlling the cruise missiles. And what was interesting for me was the way in which that allowed the landscape itself to become, abstracted, but also it was a way of making the population on the ground disappear. A kind of virtual disappearance of the population on the ground. So I started looking at the history of photography generally in conflict, and looking at that relationship between the development of flight and the development of photography, and how those two technologies were so closely linked right from the beginning in relation to military conflict. I started to do work in photographic archives, looking for anything that I could find that was related to photographs of the landscape of the Middle East, not necessarily relating to conflict. And one of the archives that I came across was in the collection of the Freer and Sackler Gallery, which is one of the Smithsonian galleries. It's the Asian collection of the Smithsonian galleries at Washington, D.C. And I had actually gone to look at some photographs by an Iranian photographer called Sevrigan, who had produced a really enormous collection of extraordinary photographs of Iran. But actually what I found, the archivist showed me these photographs that were taken by a German archaeologist called Ernst Herzfeld. And Herzfeld was really interesting for me because he'd worked in the Middle East from the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. Not only was he an archaeologist, he was also a very keen amateur photographer. And one of the things that was extraordinary about his photographs was the fact that he would often photograph his journey to a site. So he worked in Iran, in Persepolis. He worked in modern-day Iraq, in Syria, Lebanon. And they had these amazing photographs that showed, so for example, this one shows a very famous site in Iraq, the Arch of Ctesiphon. And what interested me about this particular photograph was usually you see photographs of the building, the structure, and their kind of center frame. So here we see something more of the landscape around it. But what was interesting was that they had all of his test prints. So they had his negatives, they had his test prints, his final prints. So you could sort of work out his working method. And this image really struck me because he's standing with the sun behind him. So his shadow is cast in front of him and appears in the image. And what he does in the image that is more finished is that he retouches the photograph quite crudely, but he removes himself from the image. So I was very interested in that idea that the photographer wanting to remove the evidence of their presence somehow, to make the photograph appear to be taken anonymously. So he often would take these photographs, as I said, from quite far away. Very rarely, this is an unusual one, would you see the figure in the landscape, which was unusual for European photographers working elsewhere. And sometimes the photographs appeared to show nothing. It appears that it's very difficult in some of the photographs to identify what the focus of the photograph is. So in some of them, they just look like photographs of a kind of empty landscape. And he was working with this panoramic format. Sometimes he was taking multiple shots. He was cutting the photographs together, joining them up, painting over them. So it's quite interesting to see the working process. Here's another one. This one was really interesting for me because actually the site appears in this image on the far right-hand corner, far right-hand edge of the horizon. There's a tiny prominence on the right, and that's actually... You see it in another image. It's actually this ziggurat at Samarkand. So I just thought that the contrast between that image and the other was so extraordinary. I then went to the Air and Space Museum, which is also in Washington, and I was trying to find aerial photographs, any aerial photographs they had that related to war. And they had an extraordinary collection, which are now actually in the National Archives in America, of photographs that were taken in 1918 by a special unit that was set up by the American Air Force when they joined the war. And it was established by Edward Steichen, which I thought was really extraordinary because I hadn't been aware of this work before. And what he did was he worked with a group of photographers who were working with very large format cameras. They were flying out over the Western Front about 2 or 3 times a day, processing the film, making these albumin prints, and the military. They were used as a kind of way of deciding how to move on the ground. But what struck me about the images was just how extraordinarily beautiful they were. They're completely abstracting the landscape. They're showing the landscape. I mean, this is like 4 years into the war. The landscape below is almost completely, everything on the ground is almost completely obliterated. There's in some of, very close to the front line, there were no buildings or trees left standing. These are photographs of the trench systems. So the trenches are designed to move in a kind of zigzag, so that if a shell drops in the trench, the blast doesn't travel along and kill everybody. It just is kind of limited. The damage it can do is limited. So I was really struck by the difference between what we're seeing from above and what it must have been like on the ground. There's another example. So it starts to look like the surface of the moon or something. These are like lunar landscapes. And this is an example showing how a site that's been targeted has been revisited by the photographer. So on the image on the left, you see the site, then you see it after so many sorties of bombardments, and then you see it completely and utterly obliterated. And I was very struck by the contrast between that image and an image like this, which is somebody photographing what's actually going on the ground. So that kind of this gap between those two things. So during the first Gulf War and since, I was really interested in reading the work of Paul Virilio, the French philosopher. He's written a lot about the relationship between the technologies of photography and film and the technologies of war. And he'd written an essay in 1980 called The Aesthetics of Disappearance. And one of the things that struck me in reading that was a very small part of it, which is a story about the filmmaker Méliès, the pioneering French filmmaker, and how Méliès had been filming in the street in Paris one day, and he was just filming people coming and going, and the camera at some point stops running, it jams, and Méliès gets it working after a while and continues to film. And then when he processes the film and he looks at the footage, he realizes that in the kind of accident of the film jamming, he's actually been able to make people either completely disappear or to transform them from one thing to another. So a man might turn into a woman. So it was about this idea of the kind of magical potential of photography and film, and the very simple ways in which we can kind of play with it and have a kind of visual trick or a conundrum, a little bit like the Herzfeld, retouching himself. It's so simple, but it makes such a difference to the image. So one of the other places that I did visual research was the Arab Image Foundation archive in Beirut. The Arab Image Foundation was founded in something like 1907 by a group of Arab artists, photographers mainly, and their mission is to try and rescue the photographic heritage of the Middle East and to collect from the earliest photographs till I think about the 1960s. And they've now amassed something like 500,000 photographs and negatives, and they're a really important and vital resource for photographers. And it's a very important historic project. But one of the books I found there was a book that was about a French aerial photographer. He was actually called Poidevard, and he'd worked he was an archaeologist, but he was also a Jesuit priest, which is why he traveled to Lebanon to set up a Jesuit school. And he was very interested in Roman history. And one of the things he did was photograph from the air, archaeological sites in modern, what is now Lebanon, Syria, and the north of Jordan. And I was just very struck by how similar some of these images look to photographs that were taken, say, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the atom bombs were dropped, or thinking about, European cities after the Second World War. These are some examples of his work. So starting to then think about the relationship between flight, the way in which thinking about the relationship between flight and the fact that this kind of aerial perspective offers you a view of a landscape that you might think you know, but a very different view. And thinking about how during the First and Second World Wars, quite a lot of pilots who were flying from England, for example, to Europe were finding, once they were in the air, certainly if they were flying early in the morning or late in the afternoon, that they were discovering archaeological sites that they were seeing from the air that they weren't detectable on the ground. And that was the beginnings of the discipline of aerial archaeology. So flight suddenly offered this new perspective where what interested me, where a site that's very discrete on the ground, it might only be, there might only be a few inches of ground raised over a whole kind of foundation of a building, which you'd never be able to see on the ground. But if you're in the air and it's very early in the morning and shadows are very long, you'd be able to see this image of the structure, almost like a kind of magical apparition. And I discovered this wonderful book by the art historian Kitty Hauser called Shadow Sites, from which I've borrowed the title for the film. And it's something she's borrowed from aerial archaeology. So when you discover an archaeological site like that from the air, it's actually called a shadow site. And she was interested, the book's it's an interesting history of the relationship between flight photography and for her, what she was looking at was the impact it had on the work of British artists from the 1920s to the 1950s. One of the other bodies of work that I looked at was the work of the French photographer Sophia Riesel, Hooba, who had made this series of large photographs in the early 90s of post-operative bodies. And I was very struck by the way in which the scar replicates the images of the trenches from the Steichen photographs. And she was one of the few artists, I think, who responded in an interesting way to the first Gulf War. She'd made these photographs both from the air and on the ground in the battlefields in the south of Iraq and the north of Kuwait. And so it made me start thinking about the possibility of actually making the work in the Middle East and perhaps being able to fly and working out a way of doing that, the practical side of doing it. These are some of her images. So she had these aerial shots of what are effectively trench systems. These were trench systems that housed tanks. And then she'd done lots of details that she'd shot on the ground. These are a series of stills from a film that I made in 2004. And I'd shot this in the Eastern Desert in Jordan. And this is a film piece. It's a film piece. It lasts about 15 minutes. It's made up of a sequence of short films, seven short sequences in which this man appears on this set. And in each sequence, the sun has set a bit further and his shadow has lengthened. And the film ends with him, with his shadow filling the entire width of the screen. And just before he disappears off the set, he actually physically disappears he disappears kind of magically. I'd already made this film, and I hadn't really thought about the connection between the shadow and shadow sites. This came later. But what struck me when I started looking at aerial photographs of the region was how this landscape in which we were filming and photographing in 2004 had some kind of mysterious structures in it that you had a sort of sense of when you were on the ground. It's a landscape that's covered in basalt rock, and in some areas the rocks are quite big, and you could see that at some point structures had been made from the rocks. So structures that looked like cairns, which I sort of always associate with Northern Europe, and sometimes there would be a whole series of them, and you'd realize if you stood in the right direction that they would, be disappearing into the distance in a straight line. So there was obviously some kind of order to what was going on the ground. And when I started looking at aerial photographs of the same area that had been taken by archaeologists, I discovered these extraordinary structures. This is the same landscape we were filming in, totally unaware that these structures existed. So these are kind of prehistoric structures. Archaeologists aren't even sure what they were. They're on a very large scale. They think they could be corrals for, herding animals, or they could be homes or something. So I started thinking about thinking back to the Steichen images, thinking about the kind of legacy of the 20th century conflict and where the evidence of that exists still in the Middle East. And I was really amazed to find a book by two English archaeologists who were actually in the process of trying to document archaeological sites in Jordan that they felt were under threat. But they were working from prehistoric sites all the way up to sites that were linked to the First and Second World War. So I was really interested in the fact that they were taking this much wider view than archaeologists normally would. And one of the sites that they'd photographed was these First World War trenches, which are in the south of Jordan, very close to the railway line, the Hijazi railway line that was very critical and, was famous for Lawrence of Arabia attacking it during the war, because this was the way in which German troops were getting heavy artillery into the Middle East from the Red Sea. So the German army, the Ottoman army, had built these trenches under German orders, and they're still perfectly preserved. I was absolutely amazed. So in Shadow Sites 1, which is a sister film to the film I just showed you, we actually shot on film, and there's a shot that actually travels over these trenches in and out, so you feel like you're in the plane. This was another amazing image. So this is actually an air, how to describe it? It's like a marker on the ground. It's huge. It's like 30 meters across. And these were made by the British, who used them as a way of not getting lost when they were flying between Cairo and India during the First World War it was like the mail plane that was going from Cairo to India. And there's a particular bit of the Eastern Desert in Jordan which is very bleak, and there are very few markers for the pilots to know where they're going. And they literally marked out like 1 to 50 or whatever it was across the desert, these huge circular structures. So I started thinking about as well these kind of forms that you get which appear in the film. So the film you've just watched starts with a circular structure, which is like a prehistoric site, and then goes through to, modern farming, these circular fields. So, the image of the circle appears over and over again in the landscape. The image of the square also appears, a rectangle. So this is actually a Roman fort. These are not my photographs. These are photographs that I've taken from this archaeological book. This is an image of, in the foreground of a copper mine. So the Bronze Age actually started in this area, and copper was mined here, and the black marks on the soil are copper contamination, which is still visible. And for me, very reminiscent of, scorch marks on the ground from contemporary bombing. These are just some images, contextual images, to show you the kind of process. So here this was our plane. I wanted to go back to the kind of basics of early aerial photography. So we had a very simple Cessna plane. We had a camera. We had an amazing cameraman who devised he built and designed his own camera mount to take the 16mm camera, which he operated from inside the plane. That's what it looks like when it's moving. So we made the two films. So we shot this one film on 16mm, which is where the camera's pointing directly down at the ground and the camera's moving across the plane. As the plane moves across, the camera's filming. So when you watch the film, you're actually watching the landscape kind of dropping in front of you. So it was much more about trying to replicate the idea of the surveillance, the idea of surveying the landscape first. And then Shadow Sites 2 is shot on a very high-res digital camera, and the images are zooming in. So we're kind of zooming in. It's almost like, one is a surveillance drone and one is the attack drone. So it's locking onto a site and it's zooming in on it. These are some of the sites that we filmed. So it's a whole range of, I wanted to go right back to the earliest and most ambiguous signs in the landscape to things that were much more kind of contemporary and explicit. How am I doing for time? I think I probably should stop there, actually, shouldn't I? So just to say that I did also do a flight in the States, which some of these images come from. So I've made a series of small films, which are animations of photographs that I shot over the Sonoran Desert out of Phoenix in Arizona. And with these, what I'm sort of trying to do with this work, which is more recent, I only completed this earlier this year, is to kind of bring together the American landscape and the Middle Eastern landscape much more. So when you're looking at these films, you're not really sure where you are. So these circular field systems appear both in the Middle East, of course. Now this is a kind of farming system that's exported all over the world now. It's ubiquitous. For example, this site, which is an extraordinary, it's actually disused now, but it's a copper mine, and it's something like the second biggest dammed structure in the world. They just mine in a kind of circular system and make an enormous hole in the ground. And I just thought it was extraordinary to think about copper mining now in America and the copper mining of the Bronze Age sites in the Middle East. This is farming, arable farming, mining, and that's also a copper mine. So thinking about also the connection between these sites that look like they could be archaeological sites. It looks like an Aztec temple or something. And these amazing sites. This is a landing strip. This part of the American Western Desert has been used and still is used by the American Army for training and the Air Force. And these were temporary runways that were established during the Second World War. So all the kind of buildings have disappeared, but you just see these kind of triangular runways left in this. So again, this amazing kind of stamp of these geometric shapes in the landscape. Okay, I will finish now. Thank you.